anyways, I've been sort of working on Bellini and looking at it more closely than I ever had before. And for me, that's payoff right there. That's almost like getting paid to do this as well. So we left off on Tuesday talking about Antonello da Messina, and he plays very strongly into the history of Bellini's pictures, because according to Vasari, and probably with some legitimacy, it was Antonello da Messina who helped Venetian painters master the use of oil paints for the first time. Right? Now, some of them were using it earlier, but I say helped them learn to master it, to figure out how to paint with oils and how laying down brushstrokes is different than it would be with a tempera painting, because oil paints dry transparent, which means you don't have to draw individual lines with the brush. There are other ways of laying down washes, for example, and glazes. Whereas Bellini and others, prior to Antonello's arrival, even when they were using oil paints, were laying it down with these sort of individual hair-like strokes. Right? And when you lay down the glazes, things become more luminous. They seem to glow from within as the paint, the light of the room, our room, goes through the layers of glaze, hits the lighter opaque color, and then comes back through again. And it gives it this luminosity that we see in these works. And so we sort of worked our way through that Vasari, and with absolutely no good reason, says that Antonello learned it from Jan van Eyck in Flanders, which he didn't, because Van Eyck was dead by the time Antonello da Messina was about 10 years old. So that seems highly unlikely. But he may have met other Flemish artists who had traveled to Italy. He also had the opportunity to study Flemish works that were collected by Italians. And this all adds to his really the first Italian painter to master the use of oil paints. Right? And he comes from Sicily to Venice in 1475-76. And some people suggest that St. Jerome might have been painted while he's in Venice as well. But the bottom is neither here nor there. 1475-76, he spends 18 months in Venice. And this seems to be monumental, have an impact on the way in which Venetian painting develops, and in particular on Bellini, Giovanni Bellini. So when we looked at the Agony in the Garden from the textbook on the left, he's still, he's already interested in trying to capture a sense of luminosity, right, and color. But as an example of a work after Antonello comes and goes is Transfiguration on the right, which is roughly the same scene, right? He's gone to the mountaintop with the disciples just before they fall asleep. So it's really the same sequence of events, right? Judas is going to come later after he has the agony in the garden. But here's the Transfiguration, and you can see the degree to which the figures just seem to be infused with color and light. The hard-edged quality of the landscape in particular. These on the left-hand side here, beneath that dry tree, those Mantegna lines, which really owe much of their existence, right, to the use of tempera paint, give way to colors that seem to meld and suffuse and glow, right? This is Bellini after Antonello's trip. This is Bellini, the colorist. And from 1475 on to the end of his career around 1515, the next 40 years, right? Because Bellini's around, I want to say he's around 40 when Antonello gets there. And his color just gets richer and richer and richer. And by the end of his life, there isn't, when we look at his underdrawings, when we get our x-rays and look beneath the surface of the paint and what he drew on the canvas or the panel before he started, at the end of his career, he's just drawing outlines. That's it. There's no shading or anything. Just everything is color, right? And here's our first step in that direction, is the Transfiguration on the right. Yeah?
I saw the tree in that painting as well. Could it be the same reference to the
Oh, definitely, yeah. I think we're just kind of reshuffling the deck in a number of different ways, right? You'll notice that the two trees that frame Christ, one is alive and one is dead. And certainly that's a reference. I think he's very good about using references. Are you talking about the tree in the foreground? Yeah. Kind of. I got to say that none of this has the optical illusion of the one on the left, I think, for me, just because of the way that road splits, you know. But I think the same reference insofar as the other things we talked about on Tuesday, with the idea of the dead tree, right? And the idea of, you know, for trees, some of them are truly dead, like that one. Others are dormant, right? We talk about dead. We use this word all the time. There's a dead tree when it's not, right? When it's just wintertime and it's lost its leaves and will come back. And for artists, that was a real potent reference for the resurrection as well. So here we go, you know, much later. Here we're jumping deeper and deeper. And as we get toward the end of his career, like the one from the textbook on the left, he's painting almost entirely with color. They're just fantastically luminous works. And he increasingly understands atmospheric perspective, right? I guess these are both from the textbook. But you can see that the colors just start to just take on a fire and a glow, right? These pictures are both in London, in the National Gallery. Peter Humphrey, your author, lives in London, and that's why these pictures are in the textbook. They're not significantly better than other Bellinis. I think they're darn good. And they're probably better than our Bellinis, but at the same time, that, you know, that idea is you know, our authors often write about the ones who know the best. You remember from the Goffin reading, she talked about the fact that in many of these half-length Madonnas, the landscape background was a metaphor for the paradise that salvation afforded, right? That Christ's sacrifice at the altar, which is a theme that is wrapped up in these, the virgins giving birth to him, allows us salvation, gives us salvation. And so I wanted to deconstruct that idea because I'm not 100% sure that it always works. I don't think she's wrong, per se, but I think when we talk about metaphors and symbolisms with pictures, we have to be careful because sometimes, you know, a cigar is just a cigar, as Freud once said, you know. And what might work for the symbolism of one picture, such as the pomegranate Madonna on the right, might not work for the Madonna of the meadow on the left, right? So I wanted to look at that. Here, for example, on the right-hand side, come on, there we go, we see what appears to be shepherd, perhaps, with animals, farm animals. We see a sheep and a goat and a couple of cows in a fenced area. So we have a sense of sort of faithful stewardship, if you will, of the flock. You can also see, looking at this side, the degree to which some of the paints have gone transparent over time. So that, and again, this is indicative of the way Bellini's painting, right? He's not thinking about laying everything out by drawing first, but he's building color on color on color, and using color to model forms. And so when the paint gets suspect, right, it ends up disappearing to nothing underneath. There's probably no drawing for that. He doesn't leave a space for it, right? So certainly I think we can talk about this as having symbolism. The landscape has been tended, right? You can see that this is a garden that has been cared for by our farmer, right? It's been tended. It gives forth sustenance, right? But then we go to the other side, and it gets kind of weird. We've got a sleeping shepherd with a beast of burden that isn't working. This is almost certainly not a positive reference. This is a negative reference. A worker, whether it's human or animal, shown asleep is to someone who can afford a picture, a painting. It's a bad thing. That's an employee not doing their work, right? That's someone who is slothful, one of the 7 deadly sins, laziness, right? And this idea of the fact that the landscape might contain metaphors for bad as well as good is picked up by the bird in the foreground. You see there's a crane fighting with a snake directly off the Virgin's elbow, right? The crane with its wings back and rearing back as the snake tries to attack it. Certainly this idea of the crane and the snake is the eternal struggle of mankind. Right? It's discord. It's good versus evil. I don't know which is which. The crane is white and snakes are usually bad, so that makes sense. Right? But it's a landscape that isn't necessarily entirely paradise waiting for us to enter through Christ's sacrifice. Even though Christ's sacrifice is obviously a very strong element of this. Look at the sleeping Jesus in the foreground. So the landscape contains really much more for us than what Goffin had told us in our required reading, but in fact also contains landscape metaphors, which we'll see is something that Bellini does throughout his entire career, especially after Antonello shows him how to use oil paints better. Up in the tree is a vulture, scraggly bird, and again in a non-flowering tree. Certainly a symbol of death, right? And in many ways, this idea of good and bad on either side of the Virgin, it's interesting that the bad is on her right, even though it's on your left, right? But good and bad, struggle of good and evil, death, this is all related to, I think, how we're supposed to approach the central image, which is a very sorrowful, sad, downcast Virgin, and a Christ on her lap who is ostensibly dead. I mean, sleeping, but it's a metaphor for death, right? And the way that she looks down at him, the way that she holds him across her spreading lap, as with his arm down like this, right? The slung arm laid out as he sleeps, is Bellini's way of actually bringing in images of the dead Christ into this particular picture. Here is a Venetian woodcut artist, Domenico Campagnolo. It's on kind of a circle of Giorgione and Titian, right around that time. And there is Christ after having been lowered from the cross, now resting on the lap of the Virgin Mary, and you can see that long arm and the way in which his head is back, his arm is over on his side. It's not a limb for limb or muscle for muscle quote into the infant Christ by Bellini, but it is definitely a visual reference point, right? And that adds back to what Jay was talking about with the trees that we've seen, the backgrounds of these things, and our vulture in the dead tree here certainly reminds us of the cross, right, on a hill, which we obviously don't see. At the same time, the landscape is totally evocative of the Veneto, this region, this low, flat plain that stretches from the lagoon right up to the foot of the Alps, right, in the background. And we can see those sort of alpine peaks in the distance. We looked at this one as well, and I promised we would talk about it a bit further. Again, these very late Madonnas by Bellini. Art does this great as kids, right? He does babies so as good as anybody by this point. But we have here again a landscape that is really problematic, and certainly I do not think fits the mold of what Goffin was saying. Too bad she's no longer around, and too bad I can't get her to come and talk to us and sort of argue it through. But I think the more I look at this, the more I think that this is a landscape of peril. This is a landscape of sin, and she's separated from it. And this is in many ways the sin that Christ has come to conquer, and the sin that he will help you to avoid. So if we look at this, on the right-hand side, it's easy to miss this, but in the top of the tree, there's a bird caught in a trap up here, right? You can see its foot is in a string. and the strings, and the tree is full of bird traps, right? All those things are meant to snare birds as they come flying by. All those things that are hanging from the tree, and one poor bird has been caught. So this is a hunter, right? Someone has done this so they can capture a bird for food and kill it and eat it, right? Now, there are a couple ways we might think about the bird trap as a symbol. On the one hand, if the bird can escape, which ours hasn't, then we can talk about the soul, the Christian soul escaping from earthly peril, from the bonds of being human, to something better, to a paradise beyond. The problem is our bird isn't escaping, right? It's stuck, and that makes it much more problematic. The other prominent theme we see in 15th and 16th century paintings for bird traps is its seduction. It's getting caught in something that you didn't see coming. It's falling into a trap. And we still use that in our language, don't we? Fell into a trap. When we talk about femme fatales, right? She trapped you. So the bird traps that we see in the tree have a sort of nefarious meaning of the potential for problems, for the potential for getting caught into something that you didn't see coming, and in particular, the idea of seduction, right? And that, I think, plays through with the other things we see on this side of the landscape. Now, granted, she's flanked by two trees. We saw that in other versions as a way of doing her honor. It's still, that doesn't go away, but this landscape is populated with other details that really complicate the idea of paradise. In the foreground, at the base of that tree, we see another sleeping shepherd. You'll notice he's leaning on his elbow, right? He's leaning on his hand. He is definitely meant to be asleep. He's off the side of the path, right? There's a little bridge across there. There's almost, we can see paths as being, the right direction. And he's sort of come off the side of the path to take a nap. And sleep is never never means anything particularly good, right? With Jesus, it means death. Here, it means laziness, because he's a working man. He's a shepherd, right? He has his flock with him there as he's taking this little nap. So instead of using the stick that he's leaning on as well to move his flock along the path and be dutiful, right, to be responsible, he's fallen asleep. And look what happens. One of his little sheep or goats has gotten loose, right? It's not with the rest of them because he's not doing his job. And behind him is a hunter. Yikes, right? Danger. He's supposed to be tending his flock, and that little lamb is probably now someone else's dinner. So, with the bird in the tree, with the sleeping shepherd and the loose animal, we have these warnings against simple behavior. Now, I think a good Christian might even pull into this other meanings about how he's not Christ, who is the good shepherd who tends to his flock, right? I don't want to say he's the Antichrist, but he is certainly the antithesis of Christ in the world, right? That stretches out behind the Madonna and Child. Right? So again, these layering of meanings. Now, on the other side, Bellini has signed it on what appears to be a pedestal for a statue. But the statue is just simply not there. So the question is it a landscape tomb? Is it a memorial of some sort? Right? But he gives us his name carved into the side of it. And this is similar to the other ones where he writes it across the front of the altar, right? Or carves it. Makes it look carved there. Or puts it on a piece of paper that's been stuck up. I was mistaken when we looked at it from a distance. I thought it was a monkey because that would have made sense to me. But in fact, it's a leopard. Can you see the spots? Right? So a cheetah or a leopard. And we go back to books on animals from the Renaissance and before. And what we find is that the cheetah and its spots was seen as a symbol for sin. The spots themselves were sin that attaches to all of us, that blemishes our character, right? And sitting now very prominently on top of this marble monument certainly suggests that, right? Sinful man. This actual motif of the cheetah and this sort of open air monument, sometimes you'll see it called an altar, comes right out of Jacopo Bellini's sketchbooks, those silver point sketches, the one that's in London that we saw had to darken it so much to see. Well, it turns out that in 1505, first the sketchbooks went from Jacopo Bellini to the older of his two sons, Gentile. Giovanni's the younger of the two sons. And Gentile died, I think, in 1505 or so. And when Gentile died, the sketchbooks went to Giovanni. So one should expect in the early 1500s this renewed interest in Dad's art, right? In these wonderful books that were really intended as inspiration for different kinds of compositions, right? Now, I have not found anybody that is going to talk to me about what's going on behind that, right? There's a figure in the back in blue that appears to be standing at almost the exact same sort of thing, but it looks more like a well or a cistern, doesn't it? As if he's drawing water out of it. But the other two figures, chatting, it looks like a pickup. Yeah, but they're not. They're clothed, you know. They're contemporary costumes and hats. And I think that they're both men as well. I mean, it's hard to say for sure, but they certainly look as if they're dressed. There's something about, again, we talked about seduction, right? Warnings against slothfulness, against lust. On the other side, does this continue that theme in one way or another? And am I misreading the figure against the tree as being male as well? Because the figure on the right certainly is, right? But these figures that sort of are hanging out in the landscape, you see again and again, not only Bellini, but right in your picture, in Giorgione, who studied under Bellini. You go back in the landscape and find these figures that are sort of idling in the landscape. And the question is whether or not the meanings that might be there for Bellini continue under other people. So it's a fascinating bit. I wanted to point to one other thing, and this is something that we see in other Bellinis. You might not see it right away, but just we'll circle it here instead, right in here. That's his fingerprint. He does this all the time as he's working the paint. He goes in with his thumbs, and he actually works the paint with his hands in addition to the wet paint, in addition to with the brush. And when we look closely at Bellini pictures, we can, in fact, find his fingerprints everywhere, right? Not just metaphorically, but in fact, literally, as he goes back in and touches the paint with his thumb. And you can see it, there's a kind of nice little ridgy quality to it, right? That from a distance disappears, but gives it that sort of coloristic vibrance, because you get the light greens, you get the darker greens, right? And it gives it sort of a zip, right? And almost recreates what the tempera paint did with the single strokes, right? But that's not what he's doing. In Cast in the Shadow, it looks like she's got boots on to me, right? I'm seeing knee boots. The problem with the handout is you can't tell whether or not he's given her breasts or not, right? Which would be what would define her. But I'm looking at the basic, the pose, right? The poses of these two, there is some seduction going on, right? The way that knee comes forward and the way he leans into her, with his codpiece, no less, right? So you can even see that his codpiece there. He's not erect. That's part of the costume, right? But they are definitely engaged with each other with great interest that's not just friendly, right? There's something more going on, something very flirtatious with those pictures. One of Bellini's most famous pictures is up at the Frick collection in New York, and it's illustrated in your text as well. So I thought we should cover this because it's kind of hard to talk about Bellini and landscape and the details of the landscape with their metaphoric content, their allegorical or symbolic content, without looking at this picture. For my money, one of the 2 or 3 best pictures in all of New York. And I say that without reservation. It's just fantastic. And as most people would say, maybe Bellini's best picture, one of 2 or 3 just knockout paintings. So St. Francis, you know the story of St. Francis. He went to a mountaintop accompanied by one other monk from his monastery, Brother Leo. And while praying, and Brother Leo's sleeping, this is very much like Jesus and his apostles, right? Brother Leo takes a little kip, and St. Francis, deep in prayer, is rewarded for the depth of his devotion by receiving the wounds of Christ, right? And he carries them for the rest of his life, called the stigmata. Stigma means mark in Latin. The stigmata. So in his hands he gets bleeding holes. In his feet he gets bleeding holes. In his side, the 5 primary wounds of Christ, right? Hands, feet, and side. So this is the very moment when he receives the stigmata. This is the very moment we call it his ecstasy, because it's not, sexual ecstasy, it's spiritual, right? Communion with God. So he looks up to the upper left corner of the picture, and he's from that direction comes his reward. Bellini uses the landscape in the background to show his distance from civilization. He's on the other side of the river. That's a little trick he's learned from Mantegna, right? We saw it going back to the agony in the garden, the separation of the holy figure from the others, from the everyday. We have a city wall, a tower with a gate, right? So it's a fortified city. We're outside of that, right? We're on the other side of the river, on the other side of the bridge. And we can sort of begin to follow our eye from that city, from that far shore, through the landscape, up the bit of the rise, to meet St. Francis here. Where he's living, and Brother Leo is not there. He's been omitted, right? But St. Francis has set himself up a little abode by using this cave that he's added to, right? And the more we look at this picture, the more fascinating it becomes. So he's cut down some trees, right? And he's got some twine or some vine to tie them together into a nice little study. So we saw, it's kind of like St. Jerome's study inside, right? But here he is. He's got a desk he's built, right? Little carpentry there, simple carpentry. And so it's a place for him to study, and he's communing with nature, right? And that's kind of the theme is St. Francis and his respectful communing with nature. This is part of the Google Art Project Gigapixel collection. You can download a picture. It took 15 minutes for this thing to download. It's huge. Right, but I cut a bunch of, use Photoshop to cut a bunch of details from it. It's fantastic. So we really dive in close, right? So there's his little desk, and you can see with his little desk, a little arbor that he's built, you can see his handicraft, right? Not only in the simple construction, maybe a carpenter would say, look, this is a simpler way to build a desk than that, but he's not a professional carpenter, right? He's just hammering it out for himself. But more than that are the different branches that have been tied together to make this arbor under which he works. Notice Bellini's interest in sort of how these are tied, right? And each one of them starts to almost look like a little crown of thorns or something, doesn't it? To remind him of Christ. But he's really kind of, I think Bellini is very much interested in how he's taken nature and transformed it and turned it into his domicile, the place where he's going to stay and live as he prays in the desert. And as I was looking over this massive gigapixel image, I saw something I'd never seen before. Just behind St. Francis's head is one of the trees he's cut, right? And you can see that just off his shoulder there, whacked off, it's been cut. But he didn't cut the whole thing down. So he's not clear cutting. He's not going to whack down everything. He's going to let nature be on a certain level. He's going to take what he needs. but he's not going to take what he doesn't need, and he's going to make sure that nature will come back, and he knows that when you trim trees, if you leave part of it, it will continue to grow. So we have the source of these things that he's been using for his little den, but also this symbol, and I don't think this is Mark's take on this, right? But I think that it shows this, it feeds into his respect for nature, that he's left it be, not entirely, but allowed it to continue. I don't know why this slide came up like that, because I just constructed it wrong. But there we can see the book that he's been reading, and now we can dive in so very closely, right? As he's been studying, his ecstasy, his physical transformation, his communing with nature, and through that with God, is picked up by, or is inspired by his studies. As a teacher, I want to tell you this, right? Studying leads to understanding, right? Studying leads to change. Reading things is good. We become different people. We become better people. We commune with whatever we might call God for doing that, right? Our guest speaker during Ethics Week talked about the fact that the only way she could ever write anything was because she had to study it, and then she actually had something to write, and it became easy after the study. Well, here Francis is being written on, isn't he, in a way, by God himself. Again, you can see just at the base of the book, right in here, fingerprints, right? In this case, using them in order to get the sense of wood grain across that rough hewn. If we look more closely, well, first on top of the desk, lest he forget, all men must die, he has this skull that's placed there as a harbinger, a reminder of death. And you'll notice that he's also, in addition to fashioning this shelter around the cave, he's also made himself a little cross, because as he did this, he was reminded of the cross, right, all those crossbars of wood. And so he made himself a little one, and lo and behold, the knot that holds it together looks exactly like the crown of thorns is hanging from it that he also made, right? So he's made himself not only reminders of his own death, his own mortality, but also reminders of Christ's own sacrifice for him, right? And there's a nice detail of that, right, of the crown of thorns hanging from his, again, self-fashion. So there's a connection, right, between this crucifixion and the little shelter that he's crafted for himself. The other thing I wanted to point to was at the very top of it, and I'm sorry, I wanted that to come in a bit later, my animation, but you can see there's a little bell up there as well, hanging from the top of that arbor with a string so he can pull it, and the string comes down far enough that he can reach out and grab it. And I think, this is just my guess, that the bell is there because when you took communion, the bell would ring when the communion was blessed. So if he's going to live apart from civilization, he still needs to take communion. So the bell is there for when he blesses the communion, he rings the bell. Right? That's just my guess, is that's meant to be a communion bell. But you'll notice again, he found a tree that had two arms coming off of it with a little U-shaped bracket that he could hang his bell in. So it's, I like the fact that St. Francis is really crafty. The thing I wanted to show you that you can't see so well is that growing around this shelter that he's got are grape leaves. So in addition to the idea of him where's he going to get the communion out here? Well, the grape leaves are going to provide that, right? So he's got a grape arbor growing over the top of this fashioned den that he's made. That provides him the grape for the communion that he can then use to commemorate Christ's death, which is exactly part of the theme that he's got. And all that stuff together, it's a really tight symbolic package, right? With this idea of communing with nature, I like that Bellini's signature is tacked to one of these scrappy little trees down here, and that he, we talked about artists becoming like St. Luke, Bellini coming like St. Luke when he paints those half-length Madonnas. Well, here I think he's seeing himself being like St. Francis, right? That he too is finding his place within nature as part of that cog. I love the little bird there, kingfisher maybe. I don't know the symbolism of it, right? But birds in dead trees, kind of potent little symbols, aren't they? In and of themselves. And certainly the dead tree probably picks up some of the same symbolism we've been talking about. But there's a bird. I wanted it to be a cardinal because I got confused thinking it was St. Jerome, and it's not St. Jerome, so a cardinal doesn't matter, right? But it is this cute little red-faced bird in the corner. I've got a detail of it. There he is, right? And that gives you a sense of just how big this scan is that you can find online. It's pretty terrific. Thank you, Google. Right? So back away from the picture. First, you can see it's painted on panel. And what we're seeing here is called the barb, B-A-R-B-E, and that's where the original frame would have sat, right? That Bellini never painted because he painted it in the original frame. And the frame is now missing, right? It's a new frame. And so we see the unpainted surface of the wood, which is great for historians because we know whether or not the painting has been trimmed, right? By looking at the barb, we know it hasn't been sawn off on the sides and cut down from a larger work. More important than that is returning to the subject matter we've been talking about, communing with nature. Nature's providing him with the raw materials for his communion. Nature has provided him with the raw materials for his house. Nature is also providing him with the water that he needs, right? There's a natural spring that he's fashioned a little spout onto here. So he's not, God is providing for him. And I read somewhere that Francis's followers look to St. Francis as parallel to Moses, leading the Israelites. This is Francis led the Franciscans, right? And there is a moment as Moses is leading the children of Israel out of Egypt where he hits a rock with a staff and water miraculously springs when they're so thirsty that they need it, right? So St. Francis here is also provided for quasi-miraculously by God. And in fact, the ecstasy of St. Francis is sometimes called St. Francis in the wilderness or St. Francis in the desert, even though it's not very deserty, with the idea that his time spent away from civilization is similar to Moses in captivity, right? Okay, so again, everything is fair. By communing with nature, he gets the stigmata, right? And you can see there's just these tiny little marks on his hands. Again, I love these details because they give us a sense of how Bellini works. Again, I don't know the degree to which we're seeing fingerprints, but there are definitely places where you can pick it up. I think in your picture, right, there are pieces there as well. Right, so he's in a moment of receiving the stigmata, and we can actually see it on each of his hands, right, the little red dot in the center of his palm. I've got this, something personal, right? I've got a psoriasis problem. And it's right there. And only if I'd lived in the 15th century, I probably could have been a saint, except for my lifestyle. But other than that, I could have been a saint because I've got stigmata. But every now and then somebody comes up to me and goes, "Oh my God, you've got stigmata." And I didn't see God have anything come down to us. Now that I've mentioned fingerprints, there definitely is one right there. Right? You can see it on the side of that, on the top of that flower. There's part of his thumbprint. Right there. Interestingly, his feet don't have the marks yet. So we're right in the middle of the process, right? The little red mark isn't here, and Bellini has given us to where we can actually see that foot coming out. And there is no stigmata on the foot, even though there will be. He will have it on his hands and his feet and his side. So we are right in the middle of the action, right? We are right at the moment of transformation. Part of it has happened, part of it has not, right? And it's happening because of his communion with nature. And this is where Bellini has made some rather significant changes. I'm going to show you two previous versions, the most famous two previous versions, both by Giotto, When St. Francis receives the stigmata, he usually has a vision of a crucifix floating in the sky, borne aloft by cherubim, half-length, red-winged angels. And there are direct lines from Christ's hands and feet and side to Francis's. So it ends up almost looking like a marionette, like a puppet, and in fact the cross behind Christ, no disrespect, but almost looks like a puppeteer's thing, doesn't it? But this is the norm, right, is that he sees the crucifix. Now, what's interesting here is Francis has a crucifix that he's made, right? Not a crucifix, a cross, because the crucifix has Christ on it. But he's made a cross, and he's put the crown of thorns on it to remind him of Christ, so it's a quasi-crucifix. But he's turned away from that, and looks up to the heavens, and he's already receiving the stigmata, but there is no Christ or cross up there to see. All he sees is nature. And that goes back to this theme that we've been talking about, that this is St. Francis communing with nature, finding God everywhere. Right? The most famous Giotto is in the Church of St. Francis in Assisi. The church dedicated to him, which probably Bellini was more likely to have known. It's closer to Venice, and if you're going to model it after a St. Francis, then why not the canonical one? Why not the home of Francis's grave, right? And so there's Christ again, arms out as if on the cross, borne by cherubs, and the lines coming down. None of that appears in Bellini's. All we have is the idea of revealing the places where the stigmata should be, right? And not seeing it everywhere. It's not on his feet yet. So that's really kind of an important thing. He looks up, and now just if I can prove it to you, right? Nature, look at this tree. It's fantastic. It bends toward him. It's almost as if St. Francis is a wood magnet, and the tree is being drawn down toward him, right? Because he's receiving the stigmata not from God, but God revealed through nature. And for me, that's the theme, right? That's why St. Francis has gone away from the city, gone out here, is to get in harmony with God's creation. And that's exactly the case here. He is in harmony with his creation. I love the fact that there are all these elements, compositionally speaking. Francis comes up like this and then stands back, right? Well, there's a tree, doesn't it? That's the same thing. You look at this, we start to see back his body in the rocks, isn't it? And the way he sort of laid out clearly like this really ends up looking like Francis, doesn't it? Like just his torso repeated. So he's seeing, he's one with nature. Everywhere we're looking, people are going, I don't know if this is too far, but 1, 2, 3, the Trinity's out there. I mean, there's plenty of other things here that are more direct, right, without going there. But I do like this idea that Bellini is working the composition around this saint being in total harmony with nature. I love this. I've never seen this before. Even when I've gone to the Frick, the light that's coming through that cloud is so spectacular, right? That, heaven is opening up. The heavens are opening up for St. Francis. And just the streaks, that's new to me, right? That's because of these, again, thank you, Google, for allowing us now to see this better than we can even see it in the Frick. Again, he populates the landscape, right, with various elements. You'll notice that in this particular one, we have a shepherd again. We've seen that in other Bellinis, but he's not asleep, right? He's a faithful shepherd. Maybe he's a reminder of Christ, the Good Shepherd, but certainly it's a symbol of faithfulness, which enhances or supports what we've been talking about with Francis. His stigmata is a reminder of his faithfulness to God. It's a reward for his faithfulness to his studies, the depths of his devotion. And so our shepherd in the background, cute sheep too, is here as a way of reminding us of exactly that. There's a red-eyed blue heron standing on the edge of that cliff and looking over the edge. It's not a very steep cliff, or not a very high cliff, but there he is looking up. Herons were seen as symbols, again, this is all over Renaissance Christian literature, symbols of steadfastness. They can stand above the current, right? When they're in the water, the current goes around their legs and they can stand there, right? So they're steadfast. And that certainly relates directly to St. Francis. Not everything in the landscape, however, is good, and there's a sense of both good and evil existing out here, and St. Francis finding what he needs. The mule, the donkey, donkeys are seen as symbols of belligerence. They kick back against being told what to do. And this is why they always appear at the Nativity with the infant Christ after his birth. There's an ox and a donkey. The ox obeys its master, right? That's the Gentiles, right? The donkey disobeys, refuses to listen, and that's the Jews who didn't hear the message of the Messiah, according to religious writings from the Middle Ages and Renaissance. So our beautifully rendered donkey, isn't that terrific? Jackass, right? There, he seems to be making noise almost. He's almost too cute to be bad, in a way, isn't he? But certainly that's the standard metaphor for donkeys is a sense of belligerence, right? So, pardon me?
Ears make him not so cute because when a horse puts the ears out.
Oh, kind of cantankerous. Yeah. That's a really good point. I hadn't thought of that. He's pulling them back not to listen, but to sort of like when they're about to start to kick, right? As they say, kick against the goads. Right? So yeah, and then one thing I'd also never seen before, directly beneath Francis's hand is a little bitty bunny, sticking his head out of. It's like Punxsutawney Phil, right? He's coming out to see him. And boy, was he wrong, huh? We haven't had any recent winter yet. But regardless, some people have, and there's a little bunny rabbit sticking his head up to see what's up, and rabbits are standard, like we've talked about, are standard metaphors for sin. He's poking his head out. So, in many ways, I think both the donkey and the little bunny are the things that Francis is avoiding out here. But there still is danger. You can't escape it, right? But Francis has figured out a way to avoid it, and by doing so is rewarded by God for his steadfastness. Right? So a terrific painting, right? I mean, really knockout. If you're ever in New York, heck with the Met, go to the Frick collection on 72nd and 5th and see this picture. It's really one of the 3 or 4 best pictures in the whole of New York, and not all that big for all the details that we've seen. Right? I always, whenever I see it, I go like, wow, it's so small, right? Because I remember it being bigger than it really is. Well, his picture is very, very similar to one that some of you are working on here by Bellini. And again, you can notice it's 30 years later in his career, but it's almost exactly the same theme. The saint who has left civilization behind to go out and commune with nature, to get closer to God, right? And Bellini is very good about giving us that distant civilization. You'll notice that he makes it bad because it's in ruin, right? There's nothing left there for us. Why go back to civilization when everything that is there is left entirely in ruins? This is, mankind's works, the things that we make and do, simply don't last. What lasts is our faith, right? What lasts is what we have inside of us. That's what's most important. I like the idea, this sort of just dawned on me as I was throwing these slides together, of the city across the lagoon. Almost as if this is like a Venetian experience. You have that city on an island out there. And it doesn't look like Venice by any means, but the idea of being surrounded by water as that little spit of land is certainly, I think, something that's inspired by Bellini's experience in Venice. Right? The entryway to his little cave, you'll notice that it's sunlit, but there's this archway. It's kind of an odd lighting, isn't it? On one hand, this up here, right, protecting natural rock arch up there, or maybe that it's the light of heaven, that's made it inside the part of this cave. But if you think about this as being his face, right, coming from here down the hill across this cistern, again, God providing, right, with the cistern that he's built, and it came in the back of the pier. This is his face. Then this is the boundary of his face. Is that left, right? Where the grass is. Dry grass. You'll notice growing very prominently right on that boundary is this and it's a fig. Right? It can be identified. You shouldn't be surprised that Bellini's paying that kind of attention to landscape. But figs were seen, multiple references, a fig leaf, right? So one could think about original sin and moving past that into. But also, writers in the Middle Ages and Renaissance talked about the fig as a symbol for Christ. That, and don't ask me how, this is what I read, so I'll pass it on to you, right? I do like the idea of sort of ignoring sin, moving past it, right? Some theologians even suggested that the fruit of the tree of knowledge might have been a fig, simply because why apple, right? The Bible doesn't say anything about apples, right? With that idea of boundary, up above, hanging from the lip of the cave is ivy hanging down. And you'll see more ivy growing on the rock shelves above St. Jerome's head. Ivy is, because it can cling to rocks in precarious places, it's like the heron. It's steadfast, right? It's tenacious. It doesn't give up, right? It hangs on. So, dedication, right? Fierce dedication is picked up by this. And these, again, help to give us more of an understanding of what he sees in St. Jerome. Almost looks like a figure drawing pose, doesn't it, Huda? Something that a model might take in the studio. Here is St. Jerome, barely clad, reading his Bible with his pet lion next to him. St. Jerome has exposed to us the majority of his breast. This brings in multiple stories of St. Jerome. So we see him, we already saw him in his studio, right? But that's no one to see him. We saw St. Jerome studying the Bible in his studio. When he goes off to the wilderness to get away from civilization, he just keeps doing the same thing, right? So he's still studying. The Bible doesn't have as many books now to study. Maybe he's studying nature instead, right? And bring that into it. But whereas St. Francis had the skull and the crucifix with the crown of thorns on it to remind him of mortality, what St. Jerome did to keep himself focused on metaphysics rather than natural life is he beat his chest with a rock, right? Just took a rock and would just, right? And the pain and the suffering on his skin made him feel closer to Christ, who had his skin destroyed, right? But also left him uncomfortable in his physical being, with the idea that the physical is not important. What's important is the supernatural. So the bared breast of St. Jerome here, while it doesn't show us the wounds of the rock, it reminds us of that, right? It reminds us of other things that he has been doing. Now, the lion next to him that we see is one of many animals that appear in the landscape, and it goes back to the legend of St. Jerome, who actually kept a pet lion at his monastery. And the lion had been terrorizing the countryside. This kind of sounds like an Aesop fable. But the lion had been terrorizing the countryside, and St. Jerome went out to figure out what was wrong, and it turned out the lion had a thorn in its paw, and he pulled it out, and the lion was like, ooh, he started purring, right? He became his best friend. Followed him back to the monastery, and he kept it there. This is a legend, right? And the legend is quite funny, actually. One morning at the monastery, one of the sheep was missing. And everybody immediately assumed the lion ate it. right? And so they expel the lion from the monastery. You can't come back, you ate our sheep, you're dangerous, right? And as it turns out, what happened is that some travelers that had come to stay at the monasteries often put up pilgrims, had stolen it, right, and left it at the crack of dawn and taken it with them. And the lion knew this. This is a great legend. It's so fun. And so they go off and, to their destination. And on the way back, right, he sees them. The lion has been expelled from the monastery. Sees these pilgrims. And they still have some of the meat from the lamb, or maybe they still have the lamb. And he goes out and he screams at them, roars at them, and they run away from him, right? And he goes over here and he roars at them, they run this way. And he basically uses his fearsomeness to scare them to where they have to walk back to the monastery, right? And they appear at the door of the monastery and says, "Please save us from this lion and the..." they say, "Well, what's with the sheep?" And they get the sheep back, and Jerome gets to take his lion back with him. It's a charming story, right? None of it's probably true, right? But there we are. And so this is why Jerome always appears with the lion, and you can see he looks fearsome. A little bit better drawn than Antonella's. We're still not quite there yet, right? But it's rather almost a credible lion. I don't imagine that Bellini had a lot of opportunities to draw lions from life. But he might have seen them in other works of art and used those as an example. Up above in the tree is a bird of prey. Sometimes it's identified as a falcon and sometimes as a hawk. I kind of like falcon, but I'm not a birder by any means. The falcon was usually a symbol of pride. As a bird of prey on the prowl, directly above those bunnies, it can also be the turmoil of the world that good Christians are trying to escape, which would tie into the meaning behind it, right? But if it were pride, indeed pride, then it becomes a bit harder. St. Jerome was known to, because he was such a good scholar, because he was able to read all of the ancient languages and translate them into Latin, he said that his biggest problem was dealing with pride. So that could relate here, the pride of the scholarly St. Jerome, and maybe a warning about not being too proud, about being good with your studies, about being a straight A student, and there's other things to worry about out there. But I do like that it's not unlike the crane that we saw fighting the snake, with the bunnies down below, which themselves are fighting, or maybe mating, right? They seem a little randy. But he's directly above them, and so one has to imagine that once those bunnies get done with their bunny business, one of them is dinner, right, to Mr. Falcon and the rest of his family, right? Squirrel, notice again, painted after everything else is painted. Again, he's not really reserving spaces for these, but building up the paint in color, especially here late in his career. Because squirrels squirrel away their food, because their food comes from constant searching and digging and storing things away, they became symbols for perseverance, right? Jerome is certainly persevering here. At the same time, it's also associated with pride because of that wonderful tail. I mean, what makes a squirrel not a rat, right? It's the cute tail. And so they're always flipping the tail up, when they're playing, and they became seen as, like the falcon, a symbol of pride. So this might also tie into Jerome's pride as a biblical scholar. At the same time, right, I call them randy rabbits. Right? They're almost like the two figures under the tree in that Madonna that we were looking at. The idea that there is lust out there because they're interested in each other, right? I don't think they're just playing. There's a way the haunches are tightened up behind suggests that they are about to mount. One about to mount the other, and indeed the one that's gone down on its stomach is submitting to this idea. we'll see in other Bellinis, probably not today, but on Tuesday, he does not shy away from sexual material within his works, and that's certainly, I think, the case here. Finally, there's a salamander down by the cistern, down by the water, and again, Bellini understands nature, right? Not only is the water there amid this very arid, rocky landscape, so it provides for Jerome, but where's the salamander going to be except near water sources, right? And so he gets that. In the Middle Ages, salamanders were believed to survive fire. And for that reason, they were believed to be symbols of sin, right? Would be consumed by fire. Since consumed by fire, salamanders survive. Trust me, it's out there as a possibility. Again, I think there are all these references in the landscape that can be taken multiple ways, right? They don't always have exactly the same symbolism. Even the bunnies themselves might have multiple meanings as we look at them more closely. But you'll notice with this picture, just like with the more popular, better known St. Francis from New York, we have very much the same approach to painting. A figure alone in the landscape, communing with nature, but elements of that nature adding not only to characterize that figure, but also to suggest exactly what drove him out there in the first place. What is his goal for doing this solitary activity? The last Bellini that we'll spend any significant time at is this fantastic picture. I'm surprised nobody chose it. The Feast of the Gods. One of his very last pictures. He died in 1516, but he got this commission 2 years before he died. The picture was reworked by Titian later. We'll talk about that a little bit. It's an absolutely massive picture. It was commissioned by the Duke of Ferrara. The Duchy of Ferrara butts right up against the Venetian Republic. Right? It's just up there in northern Europe, or northern Italy. And in 1514, the Duke of Ferrara, Alfonso d'Este, I don't have it on the slide. Alfonso d'Este. The Duke of Ferrara has this amazing new building, a new house that's just been built. And he commissions works of art from various painters to decorate a room that all of the walls are carved alabaster. So translucent agate-like stone, right? The Camerino's alabaster, which is his private study where he's going to read, right? And devote himself to his own study. And so these cards sort of wave, you don't know exactly what it's going on. From descriptions it seems as if the area down below, the wave side, was this translucent stone, right? Can you imagine? It's sumptuous and rich. And the walls above are going to be covered with these canvases, right? And he commissions 4 of them, right, in 1514, from the most important painters of the day. So Bellini's one of them, right nearby. Raphael, another one. Famous painter Raphael, who's living in Rome at the time, right? 2 others that you may not be familiar with. But regardless, all of them were fairly old. He wants the best people out there, the most achieved. He wants the most important painters. And they're all like, well, actually, Raphael's very young. He died at 37. They're all really well established. All of them died before they can finish. The only one of the 4 that gets it done is Bellini. And he paints this picture that had originally a forest scene behind it that sort of worked, the other figures are sort of in one range across, like trees. The background did the same thing. It had a series of trees. Right? And about 5, 6, 7 years later, the Duke of Ferrara, Alfonso, decides to commission more works to finish the series, right? And at that point, he realizes there's only one painter I want Titian. So Titian paints the other three. Two are in London, one is in Madrid. And he repaints the background to make them work together, right? Leaves the foreground, leaves the signature, but repaints the background. And he's a perfect choice because he studied under Bellini, right? But as we look at the picture, right, this whole rocky bit over here is Titian from a later program. That after having painted the other three, he paints this so that when they appear next to each other, even though they're different scenes, the landscape seems to continue across all four. And we'll have a chance to look at that when we look at Titian, right? For now, the subject matter is a bacchanal. We've talked about bacchanals, right? This is another bacchanal. This is another party hosted by Bacchus, which is, needless to say, where a lot of drinking gets done and a lot of naughtiness happens, right? Now, Giovanni Bellini certainly knew Mantegna's print, right? They're brothers-in-law. So that certainly, I don't know if he's basing it on it or anything like that, but this is just so you get an idea of what we're looking at, a drunken orgy. Now, where Mantegna's work has figures coddling each other and attempting things, right? The figure that's sitting on the wine vat, for example. Bellini's is even randier. It's even naughtier. It really is a skanky picture the more you look at it. We'll have a chance to do with more of that on Tuesday, but we'll get started here. Here's one of the Titians that was later done that this had to be fitted with, right? And so as you look at the way the trees rise in the background, the landscape, the sort of diaphanous landscape, the gathering clouds around, all of these images are images of Bacchus. I can't imagine how that works in a place where you're trying to do studies, where nothing, it's like keeping a six-pack on the desk when you're cramming for an exam. At a certain point, it might seem like a really good idea, but at the end, you just get in the way, right? So, but the opulence of these pieces would have fit with the alabaster, the studio, and you get the sense of the studiolo as being more than just a place to study, right? It's a show off. It's just, here we go. It's his man cave, right? It's a place where he can show people his incredible good taste, right? Two slides quickly, real quick. So Bacchus in this one is a child, whereas in the Mantegna print he was an adult. He was probably the standing figure being crowned with a wreath. But here's baby Bacchus. You get a really cute kid, right? And he's the one that taps the keg. I like these terms, right? It's a kegger. And he's tapped the keg and he's filling this jug with what appears to be white wine, right? And everybody around is drinking. They're deep into it, too. Everybody's kind of rendered ugly by the drink, right? And Bacchus is here sort of leading the game. He's got in one hand the plug, the bung, right, for the keg, and the bung, the hole, is draining the wine into that beautifully rendered. One of the things I really dig about this old-fashioned, I really like about Bellini is his ability to render things in three dimensions. He understands shapes and forms, and that glass jug is just perfect. The wreath in Bacchus' hair is spot on. I've got a detail a lot later about that chalice in the foreground that sets the space, that upended chalice, right? The wine vat on the right. Everything is locked into three-dimensional space and shaded just perfectly. And again, it seems to glow from within with color. Right? In the same gallery at the NGA, we've got another picture of Bacchus that you've done a little bit earlier, of Bacchus as a child, again in the landscape, almost as if he's watering plants with his wine, right? But again, these are just darling, cute kids, aren't they? They're just terrific. And what we'll see is that both of his pupils, Titian and Bellini, are just as good when it comes to kids, right? And we've come a long way from where we started looking at infants in earlier works where they really seem clumsy at best, right? One last detail real quick, right? You can see water going into the glass jug. Right. Pitcher, thank you. We will finish up the Feast of the Gods on Tuesday. We'll talk a little bit about the upcoming exam, which is 2 weeks from today, and we'll move from Bellini to quickly look at Crivelli and Cima da Conegliano and Vittore Carpaccio. Right? So that's sort of next up on our agenda. Again, if you came in late,